Hello and welcome to this explainer on Raymond Williams and the popular press. My name is Paul Richards and I'll be asking the questions, and I am really delighted we're going to be joined for this by Professor Martin Conboy. Hello.
Hello.
From Sheffield University, from the Journalism Studies Department, author of many works and essays on the topic of the press and Raymond Williams, but by amazing coincidence also this year the editor of a collection of essays called Global Tabloid, tackling the issue of culture and technology, published by Routledge. So very much in tune with the sorts of things that Raymond Williams would have been talking about if he was still with us. Professor, let's just start at the start. Tell us a little bit about how you think Raymond Williams approached the idea of a popular press and how it linked to the broader questions for him of culture.
Raymond Williams, I think in publication terms, had a golden moment stretching from 1958 through to the early 1960s, where he published Culture and Society, Long Revolution and Communications. And at the start in Culture and Society, 1958, he puts forward very strongly this notion that after the Industrial Revolution had really started to kick in from the end of the 18th century, there's an ongoing conversation, a cultural conversation, which, among many, many other things, throw up questions of the differentiation of experience of the Industrial Revolution, the differentiation of the experience of everyday life, the discovery and articulation of the location of individuals within social classes. All of these things he's very, very interested in this publication. And to be honest, communication is an afterthought to this very long and detailed analysis of a whole range of thinkers, from Edmund Burke, who some would castigate from the left as being an icon of the right, right the way through to Orwell, who some on the right would see as an icon of the left. And Williams looked at this whole range of thinkers and critics, writers, and how they interpret the changes that he thinks are central to the development of a modern English sensibility through into the present. So the really interesting thing here is that he's looking at people as varied as Edmund Burke and Orwell, and for all of their political differences, what brings them together is a series of suggestions in their work that life cannot be reduced simply to profit, or in terms of 19th century discussions, lived experience cannot be just reduced to this notion of utilitarianism. What is in it for the bosses? What is in it for the consumer in modern parlance? So I think this is really interesting. And he just comes to communications towards the end of this period. But it's clear that because modern mass communication is a really, really very important part of our lived experience, our cultural experience, our democratic engagement with politics, that for all of those reasons, he moves towards communications, and it's almost a sort of ... moment where you're waiting for the next volumes to come, where he starts to fully engage with contemporary communication. So Culture and Society is the laying of the foundations. And central to that is this notion that we start in the post-industrial revolution era through the 19th century into the 20th century to have a much more urgent need to explore what culture means. It's simply the best that has ever been thought and written and painted by mankind, because that sort of culture excluded women almost exclusively. Or is it something more to do with what Williams considered, which was this whole way of life? And the fact that you had culture as an elite form, who enjoyed that? Who had access to it? And for Williams, as an educationalist before everything, you had this question of how did you enable ordinary people to get access to the vocabulary, to the strategies, to the expository devices that are needed to appreciate the best that mankind has ever produced in terms of cultural output.
And in terms of his view of the world, I mean, you mentioned the role of private profit and so on. He is somebody identified with the Marxist tradition, but then he sort of built on that and went some of his own paths as well. I mean, how do you see his descriptions of the developments of the popular press through that process of industrialization that was also being described by Marx 100 years earlier? And what were the sort of the main developments, do you think, that he saw? I mean, for example, he was very critical, wasn't he, about the role of advertising, which he saw as a entirely negative influence on the popular press.
Yeah, in terms of his background, I mean, it's a good point. For somebody of his generation, it was not unusual to have gone through a Marxist moment and to have gone through a brief membership of the Communist Party. He joined up to serve in the Second World War at a point where the Communist Party were instructing members not to. And he ignored that. And while he was away on active service, apparently his membership lapsed. And so he never actually left. He didn't have his 1950s moment of leaving the Communist Party like many left intellectuals. The party sort of left him. And he continues very much in that what we could call a Marxist materialist mode, that its culture is embedded within the ways in which society produces artifacts, communication systems, etc. So that's there, but he's much more of an iconoclast than a straight Marxist. And one of the chapters in Culture and Society makes that really clear when he looks at Marxist views of culture. He's very against the idea that there should be a statist, Soviet Union style approach to communications. He's much more of a bottom-up advocate. When it comes to the popular press as part of culture, one of the things I find very interesting about Williams is there's a long section in The Long Revolution where he takes on the evolution of the press from the start of the Industrial Revolution. And he sees it very, very positively in a broad sense. This is an enabling medium. This is something that draws more people into an awareness of what's happening in society. More people.
He saw it as a tool for democracy, didn't he? As a way of actually drawing people into the politics. Yeah,
absolutely. But I mean, one of the things about looking at him now and looking at that moment in the 60s is that even by the early 60s, Williams was saying that from 1900 onwards, we had a capitalist press. So for him, the whole press, more or less, from 1900 through to his contemporary moment there in the early 60s, was infected by a pandering to the lowest common denominators of popular taste, the prioritization of commercial interests, the interests of advertisers, and he saw that the greatest danger was the growing corporatization of the press and the growing monopolization of the press by a very narrow range of very self-interested, wealthy individuals.
He certainly identified that growth of the media baron that maybe we identify with later decades very early on, didn't he? And he was very clear on that. As his view developed from that critique that you described there, he tries to create the idea that the communications in its broadest sense is in itself a means of production. Now, can you maybe try and unpack that a little bit for us and try and describe what it is that Williams was getting at with that idea?
Yeah, I mean, at a very basic level, particularly with the press, journalism is a means of production in that it was producing copies of newspapers. It was producing hard industrial product out of hard industrial labor. And certainly the press of the 1950s, 1960s saw itself in those terms. It was not the effete literary figure with quill in hand. This was a hack. This was somebody deploying the tools of then modern technology, the typewriter, the telephone, and this was dominated by the print unions, the railway workers who transported the newspapers up and down the country. So in one way, it's very, very typically a means of production. It's a produced mass medium. But the other more subtle way, drawing on the Italian Marxist critic Antonio Gramsci, who he deploys a lot in his work, he looks at the ways in which the intellectual process that is enabled by this industrial dissemination of knowledge is shaping thought. So it goes back to an early Marxist dictum that the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. And what newspapers are doing, particularly in this monopolized, commercialized era of the 50s and 60s, as that gathers pace, the newspapers are not in a totalitarian sort of way saying, greed is good, profit should come before human fulfillment. They're not saying anything like that. They're not as crass or as crude, otherwise people wouldn't buy them. What they're doing much more subtly is impregnating everyday life, popular experience with the normality of profit, capitalism, the normality of private control of the means of production of information, which is what newspaper journalism had become. So I think that's, if you like, that's the way that he would see the popular press as a form of production.
Mm. And just picking up your mention of Gramsci there, I mean, a lot of 60s radicals picked up Gramsci's works, prison notebooks and so on, and started to explore this idea of prefiguration, whether or not you can start to puncture holes in the present in order to peer through at the future. I think the Gramscian phrase is to wed the present to the future, or some formula like that. So the thing about Williams that is interesting to me and to everyone is that he's not just an academic, he's not just a writer, he is also an activist, and he's somebody who's trying to put some of these ideas into practice in his own times. So how did this analysis and his writing sort of translate into some of the ideas that he had of how the media and the popular press can be reformed, and how it can be actually changed, in his own lifetime, rather than waiting for a distant utopian future?
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that sort of activism aspect to his work, because for 15 years after he was demobilized from the Second World War, and he finished his degree, and then he went into various forms of adult education, and it took him quite a while before his appointment to a lectureship at university, and that was based on his publications. He just become so prominent through his publications in very populist form, and he'd spent 15 years associated with the Workers' Educational Association, and its brief was to educate working class men and women who'd missed out on the privileges of further and higher education, often because of the war years. It was a lost generation. So I think that activism carries through, and he's looking in his writing at ways in which he can intervene strategically. And this idea of interventionism is a very Gramscian notion. And just to go back to Gramsci in the 1920s, living in Italy as an intellectual, looking around what was happening, thought all of the building blocks for the revolution, the workers' revolution, are there. And what do we get? We get Mussolini. And he then has to backtrack and think, okay, what is it about the way that Mussolini has taken power, which has acted as a foil to the inevitability, as certain Marxists would see, that the material conditions for revolution were there. And one of the ideas was that Mussolini, in his rhetoric, in his styling of Italian fascism, had figured, if you like, to echo your word from before, had figured a very persuasive notion of how modern Italy could be, that modern Italians could identify with. So when Williams comes to his activism, he's very much on the circuit. He's talking, he's writing, he's producing leaflets, pamphlets. So somebody once said, that one of the criticisms you could make of Raymond Williams is that he didn't read as much of contemporary commentary and critique as he might have done. And the answer to that is that he didn't read as much, possibly because he was just writing so much. So a lot of this reading, a lot of this writing he was producing was being channeled into talking to people in educational settings. And he was very, very keen to push on certain fronts. One was education. I think that he would have been a great advocate for what we now call media literacy. He was very, very keen on the idea of the reform of universities. He was very prescient in seeing the need for what became the Open University. He was a great advocate of combining the forms of contemporary communication, notably television and radio, into a format that would enable broad dissemination of education. And when it came to the press, and particularly the popular press, he wanted much more of a role for journalists and editors in the Press Council. And the Press Council had been formed after the first Royal Commission on the Press in the late 1940s. And he thought that had become just a talking shop, rather ineffectual and very much beholden to the owners who had too large a voice. So he wasn't for citizen control of the press or anything as extreme as that. But what he did want, he wanted more ordinary jobbing journalists, more local editors involved in the decision making and the norm setting of the press in general. When it came to broadcasting, particularly the BBC, he thought that the BBC could be at one and the same time could be divested of some of its paternalistic elements, but he also saw much more of a role for the practitioners, the journalists, the technicians, and the consumers, the viewers, and the listeners in determining what the future was.
Yes, I mean, he never lost his faith, did he, in the sort of extraordinariness of ordinary people, both as consumers and producers of the media. And he hated the word "the masses," didn't he? So he never sort of adopted that very sort of Marxist view of everyone in two great camps. He saw the richness of working class culture. I wondered to what extent that is a product of his own background in Wales, with its own rich tradition of autodidacticism and libraries and evening classes and the miners sitting around talking about Dickens and so on. He seems to draw deep on that tradition as well. Just the last area for us to explore is just really a little bit of thought about what he would have made of it all today. I mean, had he lived to see the rise of the social media barons and of the ubiquity of Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and all the rest of it, how he might have applied his earlier analyses to this new media setup that we're all in the midst of, and what he would have teach us about today.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to go back to his Welsh roots for a moment, I think there's a very oblique way into that. When he was asked to identify how he saw himself culturally, he said he saw himself as a Welsh European. And I think post-Brexit, I think that's a wonderfully resonant phrase. And I think that in terms of his idealism, I think he'd sort of lost his faith in the popular press around about 1900 historically. And he certainly lost his faith in the Labour Party as the driver of changes in communication policy and reform of communication institutions by the mid-60s, when he joined Plaid Cymru. So he's still a voice, but I think increasingly from the mid-60s he's probably a voice which is, much to his dissatisfaction, is partly a voice in the wilderness, the iconoclast, talking against trends within institutional and political movements. What would he have made of the now? I think what we're living through is probably a real re-evaluation of what popular culture actually means. And I think that, very interestingly, drawing on a central term in Raymond Williams' work, is this notion of the common culture. His ideal was for society to be moving towards a culture in which we could all talk to each other using common terms with common values to enable a commonality of discussion, not a uniformity, but a commonality. So I think that what he'd be very interested in now would be looking at the demographics of mass media consumption within the era of social media. His work in communications takes a slice into content analysis, because he's very interested in the ways in which it's not simply that you have certain media which are consumed by certain classes, but what he's fascinated by is the crossover of, as you suggest, the working class cleaner who reads the New Statesman, or the banker, the city banker, who reads The Sun on his commute, or the people who will contribute to the online variants of those publications. I think when it comes to policy, he'd be very, very, I'd be tempted to say despondent about, the way that the Press Council went, and the Press Complaints Commission, and now IPSO, and the dialogue with Impress. I think he'd be pushing on those. He'd be very disappointed that the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom has gone bust, basically. So it's lack of a voice there. But I still think that the internet age, from that intellectual activist perspective, has brought the questions of the popular to the fore with much more urgency, with this added ugly side of an unrestrained populace. But one of the books I've not talked about, and I think is one of the touchstones for a lot of the work I've done, is Keywords. I think Keywords is just a fantastic contribution. And when we're talking about the popular press, if I could read from his definition in that book from 1976, a long time after peak Williams on communications, he writes, "Popular was being seen from the point of view of the people rather than from those seeking favor or power from them. Popular culture was not identified by the people, but by others, and it still carries two older senses. Inferior kinds of work, for instance, popular literature, the popular press as distinguished from the quality press, and work deliberately setting out to win the favor of the people, as in popular journalism as distinguished from democratic journalism or popular entertainment, as well as the more modern sense of well-liked by many people, which of course in many cases the earlier senses overlap." And I think that definition there, because I mean, for a start, it mentions the popular press in very unflattering terms twice. And I think to look at the internet age now and online media through the prism of his very contrasting and conflictual sense of the popular there. What does it actually mean? Because on the face of it, the internet age enables a common culture like never before. But how are the means of cultural production being affected in the context of online media? They're owned by some of the wealthiest men on the planet. They enable some of the most corrupt demagogues to spread their demagoguery. The contrasts there are quite fascinating. And I read a couple of years ago an assertion, and I can't quite put my fingers on the source, but it was an assertion that what we have today in terms of what I call tabloid culture has become, in Britain at least, in the UK, has become a sort of common culture. It's not a common culture that I think Raymond Williams would have approved of uniformly, but he would have seen potential in it. The idea that celebrity culture creates a space in which personal feelings can be discussed, the way that sensitivities towards young suicides, for instance, are now refracted through the prism of celebrity culture. Illness stops becoming a statistic through celebrity culture and starts becoming something that people that you, in a parasocial term, are connected with, because you are consuming their identity through online media. I think these sorts of aspects, and celebrity culture is just one part of broader tabloid culture, but this idea that there is less snobbery about what one consumes now. And I think what Williams would have seen a lot of positives in potential debates, but again, he would have been looking at ownership of the means of cultural production, ownership of online media, the ways in which the consumers of those online media are enabled or disabled from contributing to the shaping of those media. And of course, in the internet age, optimistically speaking, we're just taking baby steps at the moment, and the full flowering of that common culture perhaps is ahead of us. But I think Williams would have been the first person to say there's lots of giant steps to be made on the way to bringing that sort of aspiration to fruition.
Indeed, thank you very much indeed. We've run out of time, alas. We could talk about this for a lot longer, I'm sure. But Martin Conboy, Professor Conboy, can I thank you very much indeed for sparing your time with us to talk about Raymond Williams and the popular press. And good luck with the book. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you yourself, Paul, for the invitation. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you.